Another semester done, and now you guys get to start out strong with neuroanatomy. Neuroanatomy can be pretty challenging. It's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but hopefully with these videos I'll be able to kind of trim it down so that you guys aren't as overwhelmed as whenever I was going through neuroanatomy. The first thing I wanted to do that I know is super high yield for not only in exams but also on board exams are the spinal tracts. I went ahead and just threw this picture on the front of it to show you the great summary of spinal tracts that you have. You have ascending spinal tracts, which are your sensory ones. Those ones are going from your limbs and other parts of your body up to the brain, versus your descending tracts are the ones that are coming from up top up in your brain all the way down to control motor function or some sort of reactionary spot. Now, as you can see, this seems extremely overwhelming, but we're going to slim it down to just 3 main spinal tracts. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, this is a picture from my notes, but the 3 main spinal tracts I want you guys to focus on is this only descending tract I'm going to talk about is the corticospinal tract, which is the, like I said, descending tract. So this is what's going to be controlling any of your muscular movement, particularly not autonomic, but your purposeful muscle movement. You have your dorsal columns, which once is an afferent tract, just like your spinothalamic tract. And since it's an afferent, it's going to be sensing different signals. The signals that you're going to be sensing with your dorsal column tract is going to be proprioception, which is kind of where you are in a 3-dimensional space, and fine touch. That's kind of the big thing with dorsal column. Versus spinothalamic is another ascending tract, and that one is going to be doing pain and temperature and vague touch. And these are your big 3 that I need you to kind of do to really get down well. These tracks will come up continuously throughout your board questions, and I guarantee you will need to know this. So one thing you can do is, if you want to, you can go ahead and screen capture this so that way you have kind of an idea. And this is honestly my approach to any kind of neuroanatomy question that's given me trouble that involves the different tracks. Just like with brachial plexus, it's good to just kind of draw it out so that way you don't have to think about it so much. Here in my drawing, I have basically kind of my little cerebrum hemispheres, so to speak. And then we have kind of the brainstem area. We have the peduncles for the midbrain. We have the pons, which is kind of this big outpouching. Anybody that's seen like a lateral section of a pons or brainstem will know that the pons is basically just this big beer belly that kind of sticks out. And then underneath that is the medulla or medulla. The medulla is going to be extremely important because this thing right here is called a decussating, or crossing over. Why they decided to call it decussating, I don't know. I guess it just sounds smarter that way. And then the column here is going to be your spinal column, which will be taking all of the signals up and down, almost like an elevator. So that's kind of like the guide here. And then for your afferent, or all of your sensory stuff, you're still going to have your cerebrum, but this new guy here that isn't part of the diagram in the corticospinal tract is going to be the thalamus. Anytime you have signals going into or out of, to make sure it isn't sensory overload, the thalamus is going to be kind of the bodyguard. Any sort of signal that goes out of the brain or into the brain has to go through him first before it can get to any other part of the body. And so that's why it's featured here in our ascending tracts. And then for these ones, to make it faster and simpler, because it really doesn't matter location, or I got it figured out, is I just made the brainstem just this single kind of trapezoid kind of looking figure. And same here with the spinothalamic tract. You have your cerebrum, you have your thalamus, and then you have your brainstem and your spinal column. So I went ahead and made slides for each of these individual tracks, so now we have kind of like a global view and how I approach kind of neuroanatomy tracks as far as drawing them goes. Let's kind of get into more detail with it, okay? So, the corticospinal tract. Like I said before, this is your voluntary motor movement. Huge shout out to Ellie. She was my mentor / tutor whenever I was going through neuroanatomy, and she was so kind to kind of bless me with these drawings. It helped me a ton whenever it comes to understanding it. So, with the corticospinal tract, before we get into the tract, let's kind of like reintroduce ourselves to what spinal column is. So whenever you have your spinal column, right, you have your afferent nerves, which are going to be sending signals from the outside where you're sensing stuff. It'll go through the dorsal horn, go up to the brain, and then you would have your motor function, or your efferent nerves, going out through the front. So sensory in the back, and then motor in the front. This will especially be helpful to know whenever we cover the embryology when we get into the lesion sections of the YouTube series here. And even though these MRI pictures don't show it, this ventral or posterior horn and ventral horn is called the gray matter, and out here is the white matter. This is significant because the gray matter is gray because we have cell bodies or nuclei in there, versus white matter is white because of all the axons. So any of our tracts that are going up and down like elevators, the reason why it's white is because of all the myelin-rich axons that are going in the white matter here. So now we have kind of a basic understanding of the layout of the spinal cord, where sensory, your afferent nerves, are coming through the back. You have your posterior horn, and then you have your anterior horn. And then the signal is going from the anterior horn out through the efferent nerve. So now that we have that foundation, let's get into this. So the corticospinal tract, like I said, is a descending tract. It covers your voluntary motor movement, and these cell bodies that start out here are going to start in the cerebrum. They're going to come down here, and then they will synapse in the ventral horn here. So the path that it takes is kind of a wonky one, but I'll walk you through it. It starts out in the cerebrum. Once it comes down through the cerebrum, it'll pass through the midbrain, the pons, and then when it gets to the caudal medulla, that's whenever it will cross over. And here I have a good example of it crossing over here, or what it looks like on MRI imaging. Basically, whenever it says crossing over or decussates, that means like the nerves from the right cerebrum are going to cross over to the left side of the spinal cord. So that means any sort of lesion, whether it be a growth, tumor, any sort of ischemic event, if it happens above the decussation site, where it crosses over, so any point above the medulla, is going to cause contralateral symptoms. So whenever it says contralateral, that means the lesion's here, but you're going to see symptoms on the opposite side or on the left side. And same goes over here. If we have a lesion or any sort of injury to the corticospinal tract above the medulla, then that means any symptoms are going to be present on the opposite side because it happened above the decussation or crossing over site. However, after it's crossed over, if you have any sort of injury to the spinal column, then it's going to be on the ipsilateral side because it occurred below the crossing over or decussation site. Once you've crossed over, basically the spinal column, like I keep mentioning, is an elevator. It only goes up and down until it goes out into the periphery. So the spinal column tract, like the elevator I keep talking about, is going to be here on the lateral side between our posterior horn and our ventral horn. Once it reaches the level that it's needing to go to, I'll go ahead and use C5 and C6 since we have it here to the right of us. It will then go ahead and synapse to the lower motor neuron here in the ventral horn, hence why it's called gray matter, because remember the cell bodies are all there in the ventral horn, and it will leave through the spinal column, to its destination. Now, you may have heard me say upper motor neuron versus lower motor neuron, which is why they're labeled like this up here. The upper motor neuron is labeled upper motor neuron because it's the neuron above. The corticospinal tract is a two-neuron system. You have the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron, like I said, will start from the cerebrum, have its cell body of origin there, descend down, decussate at the caudal medulla, and then descend to its ultimate destination. Anytime you have a lesion, doesn't matter what side or anything, to an upper motor neuron, you will have what's called upper motor neuron signs. As opposed to, say, if you were to have a lesion to the lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron signs are going to be called a spastic paralysis, which we have listed here, hyperreflexia, a positive Babinski sign, along with these other various reflexes. Now, why is this important? Well, if you had a lower motor neuron injury, the lower motor neuron only goes from here, from the ventral horn out to the muscle itself. So if you were to damage that, or more specifically, if you look here to the right, if you were to damage any part here for this lower motor neuron, it doesn't matter how much stimulation the upper motor neuron sends it, the signal's not going to get there. And so if you had a lower motor neuron injury, you would have what's called flaccid paralysis. That means, like I said, you could try and do as much as you want to hit like the biceps reflex. You could try and hit like whatever reflex that you're trying to elicit, but it's just not going to happen. However, if you had a upper motor neuron injury, like say somewhere up here, you still have this reflex circuit. It's still able to connect. Now, however, since you don't have an upper motor neuron telling it to moderate its reflex, keep you from, like, I guess if a physician were to elicit your knee reflex or your patellar reflex, there's nothing stopping you from accidentally kicking the physician or something along those lines, because the upper motor neuron is no longer there to calm it down or to moderate its reflex or the action of it. It just kind of goes and does its thing on its own. And so you would have insane reflexes going off when you have an upper motor neuron injury. And that's what's called hyperreflexia. Now and a big thing that they love testing is a positive Babinski sign. Babinski sign is normally, let's say if you were to take a pen or something like on your reflex hammer, the back of it, that very kind of sharp point, if you were to rub that on, if you were to drag that from the heel to the toes on somebody, their immediate instinct is to curl their toes. That's because they don't have any upper motor neuron or lower motor neuron injury. However, say if they did have an upper motor neuron, so they wouldn't be able to have any sort of control, or and so their reflexes would just kind of take over. Instead, the toes would flare out instead of them curling down. And that's usually a common thing that they'll do in case if a person isn't able to purposefully move their leg. If you were to tell them, go ahead and flex or extend your leg, and they couldn't do it, this is one of the things that you'd want to do as part of your testing to make sure that they had full function of their upper motor neurons. And versus if you had a lower motor neuron injury, you wouldn't have any reflexes at all, just because, like I said, this pathway between your afferent nerve, your inner neuron, and then your efferent nerve, it's just not there. Your efferent nerve has been severed, or some sort of traumatic injury has happened to it. Usually these tend to be stab injuries or some sort of injury where the nerve itself has been cut. So that is our corticospinal tract. Next is our dorsal columns. This one is our first of our third. This is going to be our second tract that we've covered so far, but it's going to be our first ascending tract. Now, when I say ascending tract, that means that it is going from the periphery and is going to the cerebrum to tell us there's something going on in the outside world. So, with it being an ascending, that means it's an afferent nerve. Its specialty is going to be vibration and proprioception. Those are the two big ones. So whenever you're in lab and you have to use I can't remember the tool, but basically it's to help discern if the patient can feel vibrations. That's what this is using. You're testing to see if the dorsal columns are working. Another important thing is that it does fine touch / 2-point discrimination. And that's why I included this picture here in the bottom right. 2-point discrimination is where you have two small points and you're slowly separating them, making them further and further apart. And you're testing to see how long it takes before they can figure out that your body is able to determine, okay, this is two separate points versus a single point. And that's what these things are for. That's what the dorsal columns are for, is to discern fine touch / 2-point discrimination. So, a big thing to keep in mind is that the spinal column for your dorsal columns has two different divisions. You have if it's below T6, it's going to go into the fasciculus gracilis. This is going to be doing all of your proprioception, fine touch, everything that I described earlier, only it's for your legs. Now, once you get to the above T6, you're going to start seeing two different divisions in the back of your posterior spinal column. This is going to be your fasciculus gracilis and your fasciculus cuneatus. The gracilis, like I said, does your legs, and the cuneatus will do your arms. A good way to remember that is you have a gracilis muscle, so that's how you know that this middle one's going to be your legs. And then another way that I keep it straight, as long as you remember gracilis and cuneatus, if you were to stand up straight, kind of like this feller, notice how his legs are in between his arms. And just like that, your spinal column, your gracilis, which is doing all of your proprioception and fine touch and vibration for your legs, is going to be in the middle, versus your arms or your cuneatus is going to be outside. Now these guys, once the signal goes in through the posterior or afferent nerve, they're going to go directly into here. So since this is on the left of the spinal column, this is going to be the left arm. And this is going to be the left leg, right arm. Okay? So you can just follow along this diagram. So once they get up there, they're going to meet up in the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Obviously, the fasciculus cuneatus and the fasciculus gracilis will meet up in their respective nuclei. Instead of it being in the caudal or inferior medulla, this is going to decussate or cross over at the rostral or superior medulla. Once it crosses over, it's going to continue ascending all the way to the thalamus. So if you're following, since this is an afferent, the cell body of origin for the first neuron is going to be in the dorsal root ganglion. Then the next cell body, where its synapses and the nucleus, is going to be the second cell body of origin. So you have your nucleus cuneatus and nucleus gracilis. Then they cross over and are going to meet the cell body of origin for the third and final nerve in the thalamus. Now, like I said before, anything below the crossover sign are going to be ipsilateral. So, for example, if I were to have a lesion here, or more specifically, I guess up here, above T6, where it's specifically targeting the left fasciculus gracilis and left fasciculus cuneatus, that person would not have any clue where their arm is in a three-dimensional space, or where their left leg is in a three-dimensional space. Their right arm and leg would be perfectly fine. Same could be said for vibration. or fine touch if you're to do a 2-point discrimination test on anywhere on their arm or their leg that is below the suspected lesion. However, let's say if we had a lesion that was on the right side above the above the decussation on the right side. Now, instead of it being ipsilateral to the lesion, it's now going to be contralateral to the lesion. So the patient will have a lesion, whether it be in their thalamus or right cerebrum, possibly like in the post-central gyrus, is now going to present on the patient's left side. So even though they have a right-sided lesion, whether it be in the thalamus or the cerebrum, it is going to present in the patient's left side. And I also included this picture in case if you're histologically minded like myself. You have the nucleus. This is what the nucleus gracilis looks like, and this is what the nucleus cuneatus looks like. And then they are going to cross over here from the left side to the right side. The arms and the face are going to be located on the top aspect of the medial lemniscus, and the legs are going to be located towards the bottom or anterior of the medial lemniscus. And that brings up another good point, is sometimes this tract can be called the dorsal column medial lemniscus tract. A way to test to see if you suspect the dorsal columns are not working is called the Romberg sign. The Romberg sign is where you would have the patient standing straight up and you would have their eyes open, and then without having any external force to them, just tell them simply to close their eyes. If they close their eyes and they begin to wave more than you would suspect, that is called a positive Romberg sign. That's because with their eyes open, they're able to use the tectospinal tract to accommodate and kind of help balance themselves, because they're actually able to see and kind of level themselves with the horizon. However, if they close their eyes, you've lost that ability to correct for it, and you're entirely dependent on your dorsal columns to correct yourself and make sure that you don't fall over. So if you lose your dorsal columns, you have no way of correcting yourself. Okay, so I think that's all for dorsal columns. And then finally, we bring up the final tract I wanted to talk about, which is the spinothalamic tract. I love the spinothalamic tract because the other two tracts we've talked about have decussated or crossed over at the medulla, which is in the brainstem. So that really doesn't give you a whole lot other than knowing that it's in a brainstem or above or below. The spinothalamic tract, as opposed to decussating up in the brainstem, will decussate or cross over at the level that it enters into the spinal column, which I think is pretty cool and will help you determine the level of which the lesion is taking place. So we'll go ahead and break down the spinothalamic tract, and I'll come back to that point. So the spinothalamic tract, I love it, and this is another reason why it tells you what it does in the name. It senses pain with the P in spinothalamic, and for the T, it does temperature. So spinothalamic, pain, temperature. And then because it's so good at pain and temperature, it's just like it kind of does touch. So as opposed to dorsal columns, which do fine touch, vibration, and proprioception, this guy, it just kind of does touch just as a side job. So we have spinothalamic, pain, and temperature tract. Like I said before, this is a sensory tract, so it's going to be ascending, starting at your limbs and external environment and working your way up to the cerebrum. And since it's ascending, it has to make a checkpoint at the thalamus. So just like with our other ascending tract, the cell body is going to be located in the dorsal root ganglion. Once it has its first cell body go through the dorsal root ganglion, its next cell body where it will synapse in the substantia gelatinosa here in the posterior horn. So that's its first synapse. It hasn't crossed over yet. And so whenever it will cross over in front of the, I believe this is called the anterior commissure, anterior white commissure, and then it will be here. The elevator, or the tract that goes up and down, will be located at the front, in front of the ventral horn of the spinal column, as opposed to the corticospinal tract, which is going to be here, and the dorsal columns here. Your spinothalamic tract is going to be located just anterior and to the side of your ventral horn. Okay? So now that we've entered the elevator, we've already decussated. So why does this decussation matter? So now, because we've cut the line at the elevator here, we would know that anything below that is going to have contralateral signs. So let's say that this is like T6 or something like that. You're going to have pain and temperature loss on the patient's left side at T6. So I guess what would that give you? Like somewhere in like the arm, or maybe like the rib cage, the left rib cage. However, everything below T6, like T7 down, like your leg, so you're going to have loss of pain and temperature in your right leg. So at the level where the lesion took place at T6, you're going to have it in the left side. However, everything below that is going to be on the right side for your lesion. So as I was saying before, it decussates at the level of the lesion, and then it will continue ascending. It won't have any intermediates. It will go just straight to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus it will synapse and then go to the respective cerebrum on that same side. Okay. And then I know one thing that you're probably thinking of, there's way more tracks than just these big three, and that's where my friend Emily Hudspeth had made this slide. The big thing to focus on is the specific function of these additional pathways, not necessarily not necessarily their pathways themselves, but what do they do? And so that one you can kind of gather from just the name of it, like spinocerebellar. It's going to be involved with balance, just like with dorsal columns. So I wouldn't worry about the locations of them, just knowing exactly what you can do. And rubrospinal, anything to do with like the red nucleus, once again, that's kind of a balance issue as well, and can help with conscious motor. So I'll go ahead and leave this slide up just for y'all's reference. And then here's kind of like my way of shotgunning different spinal lesions. The big thing to know is like, what's the face doing in conjunction to the body? So because remember how I said everything below the decussation point or the medulla is going to be ipsilateral to the lesion, right? And then everything above it is going to be contralateral. So for this one, we have a lesion in the left medulla. Or no, this is the left midbrain, I'm sorry. And so because of that, all of your symptoms, since it's above the decussation, it's going to be on the right side of the patient, even though it's on the left medulla. But it gets, because of the trigeminal tract will go through the brainstem, does all of your sensory to your face, right? So that's going to be the same side as the brainstem lesion. Now, obviously, if it's in the spinal column, which is exactly going on with this guy, you're not going to have any facial symptoms at all. But because, remember how I told you the spinothalamic tract decussates or crosses over at the level of the lesion, you're going to have opposite pain and temperature symptoms compared to your fine touch and vibration sense and your motor loss. So, like I said, this guy has a lesion, or let's say a brown Sicard, which is a lesion we'll get into later, of the spinal column. We'll just say that this is like an upper cervical. So he's lost motor control on on his right side because it's below the decussation. So it's or below the decussation of the dorsal columns and corticospinal tract. So it's going to be the same side or ipsilateral to the lesion. However, because I said that the spinothalamic tract, the pain and temperature tract, decussates at the level, so that means it's going to be have a loss of pain and temperature on the contralateral side to the spinal column lesion. So he'll have a loss of proprioception and fine touch vibration and motor loss on the same side as the lesion, but he'll lose pain and temperature on the opposite side. And if it's in the cerebrum, it's all going to be on the opposite side. So he'll have like a left cerebrum injury, but his right side of his face and the right side of his body, all the symptoms are going to be on the same side, or all of it's going to be affected of the opposite of the lesion. And I think, well, this leads us into lesions, and I'll go ahead and make this into a separate video.